There's a specific kind of silence that lives in a room after you've been humiliated in front of 40 people who are all pretending not to watch. It isn't quiet. It's loud in a way that never fully leaves. I know that silence better than I know almost anything else in my life. I've been hearing it for 30 years, even when the room around me is full of applause, even when the people clapping are senators and university presidents and journalists who want to write profiles about what I built. That silence has a frequency, and the man who tuned me to it was named Collins. I'm telling you this now because someone will eventually get it wrong. Someone will write the short version. Troubled kid, bad teacher, successful adult, revenge story, end credits. That version already exists. I've seen the headlines. But the headlines skip the decade in the middle. The part where I was nobody, the part where I ate gas station food in a car I owned 3 months before it broke down, the part where I seriously considered that maybe he was right about me. The headlines skip the cost, and if you're going to understand what I did, you have to understand the cost first. So let me tell you the whole thing. I was born in a mid-sized town in central Ohio, the kind of place where the high school football team is the civic religion and the teachers have been teaching the same curriculum since Reagan was in office. My mother worked the front desk at a dental practice. My father, the man I called my father, the man I still call my father in every way that matters, drove a regional delivery route for a plumbing supply company. He left the house at 5 in the morning and came back smelling like diesel and dust, and he always asked me about my day before he sat down. Always, even when he was bone tired. Even when I was sullen and teenage and gave him one-word answers, he asked. I didn't understand how rare that was until much later. We weren't poor exactly, but we lived in the specific American way where every month's stability felt like a small victory. One unexpected bill, a car repair, a medical copay, could shift the whole calculus. I knew not to ask for things that weren't necessary. I knew the difference between want and need before most kids my age knew anything real about the world. I don't say that with resentment. I say it because it matters. It's why I paid attention. Kids who grow up with safety nets sometimes forget to look down. I always looked down. Growing up in a town like that, you develop a very specific kind of literacy that they don't test for on standardized exams. You learn to read rooms. You learn the difference between someone who's managing you and someone who's actually listening to you. You learn which adults mean what they say and which ones are performing the meaning of what they say, which is a different thing entirely. My father was in the first category. He was the most straightforwardly honest person I've ever known, honest in the way that people are honest when they genuinely don't understand why you'd be anything else. He wasn't a reader, he wasn't someone who analyzed things the way I did, but he had a moral clarity that I've spent my whole professional life trying to institutionalize and haven't quite managed. He would tell you the truth about what he thought, and if you didn't like it, he'd tell you he was sorry you didn't like it, and mean both things fully. My mother was more complicated. I say that with love, not blame. She was intelligent in a way that her circumstances hadn't given her a channel for. She read voraciously. She had opinions about things. She could hold an argument together with a precision that surprised people who'd underestimated her. But she was also someone who had learned early that her intelligence was most safely deployed in private. Publicly, she managed. Internally, she observed. I think that's where I got it, that specific quality of watchfulness, the habit of collecting information and holding it, rather than deploying it immediately. I thought of it as patience for a long time. I understand now that it also had a cost. I was a reader. That sounds simple, but in the world I grew up in, it made me strange. I read everything, history, science, whatever was on the library cart, whatever the librarian Mrs. Hayes recommended when I came in after school. I was curious the way only slightly lonely kids tend to be, because the interior world was more interesting than the social one. I wasn't unpopular in the way that gets you shoved into lockers. I was just off to the side, present but not central, the kid who answered questions in class but wasn't invited to parties. I tell you this because I want you to understand who I was. Before he got to me, I was intact. I was still myself. Whatever doubt I carried was the ordinary kind, the kind every 15-year-old carries. I hadn't yet learned to doubt the specifically engineered way, the way where someone intelligent and respected and positional takes a slow, systematic hammer to the foundation of your self-concept and does it so quietly that you can't name what's happening until half the structure has already come down. I entered Denison High School in the fall of my sophomore year. We'd moved across the district. My father's route had shifted. Made more sense to live closer to the depot. New school, new faces, the particular social terror of being the transfer student who has to decode an already established world. I was 16. I was fine with it mostly. I'd adapted before. The first time I heard the name Collins was in the hallway before I'd even found my locker. Two kids I didn't know yet were walking past, and one of them said, in a tone somewhere between reverence and fear, "Collins gives the test back tomorrow, and I think I failed it." The other one said, "Everyone fails it, that's kind of the point." And they walked away, and I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind, the way you file any piece of ambient information in a new environment. I found out what Collins taught when I looked at my schedule. A P history, third period, room 114. I want to be precise about my first impression of him, because I've spent a lot of years trying to determine whether my memory has been corrupted by everything that came after. I think it's mostly accurate. He was tall, maybe 6'1", broad through the shoulders, the build of someone who'd been athletic once and maintained just enough of it to project authority. He was somewhere in his mid-50s then, hair still thick and dark at the temples, a way of standing at the front of the room that suggested he had never once been uncertain about whether he deserved to be there. He dressed well, not expensively, but precisely, the kind of precision that signals effort and standards. He had the gift that certain teachers have, the one that makes you lean forward in your seat before he said anything important yet. The first 3 weeks were fine. He was demanding in the way that good teachers are demanding, not punitive, but uncompromising about rigor. He assigned primary sources when other teachers assigned textbooks. He expected you to form arguments, not just recite facts. I was good at this. I'd always been good at this. I turned in my first essay and got it back with a note at the top that said, in red ink, "Promising analytical instinct. Execution needs work." I took it as encouragement. I worked harder. I came to class prepared. By the 4th week, I was one of the students who answered his questions, not showing off, but genuinely engaged, because the material was interesting and engagement was how I learned. I don't know exactly when it changed. That's the thing about the way Collins operated. He was too intelligent to make a sudden shift you could point to. It was gradual, calibrated, almost surgical. Looking back, I can mark specific incidents. At the time, each one seemed like it might have an explanation. Taken together, they formed a pattern I wouldn't name for years. The first incident was small. We were discussing the causes of the First World War, and I raised my hand and made a point about the role of imperial competition in the Balkans, something I'd read in one of the extra books Mrs. Hayes had lent me. Collins looked at me, not with engagement, with something flat and measuring, like he was deciding something. Then he said, "That's a simplified reading of a complex situation," and moved on without explaining what the more complex reading was, or inviting me to develop the thought further. I felt the sting of it, but told myself I'd oversimplified. I tried to do better. The second incident was during a graded class discussion, one of those exercises where you're meant to argue a position, and your participation is scored. I made what I thought was a strong argument, connected to the assigned reading, logically structured. Collins interrupted me mid-sentence and said, "Let someone else speak who's actually prepared." There was laughter. Not much, but some. The specific kind of laughter that happens when you're embarrassed and other people are relieved it isn't them. I sat down. I finished the class period staring at the desk. I told myself it was a fluke. I told myself to be more concise. I told myself a lot of things that put the responsibility back on me, because that was easier than the alternative explanation, which was that something deliberate was happening. By the end of the first semester, the alternative explanation was harder to dismiss. My grades in his class were the lowest I'd ever received in any subject. Not failing, he was too careful for that, but consistently just below the threshold that would make them remarkable. My essays came back with notes that were technically accurate, but somehow never acknowledged what I'd gotten right. He didn't give me zeros. He gave me 7s out of 10 on work I knew was worth 9s, and if I pushed back, he had a reason, always articulate and professional enough that I couldn't call it unfair in any way a third party would recognize. Other teachers liked me. My English teacher, Mr. Bennett. That man was my unofficial advocate for 2 years, the one who recommended me for the writing competition I'll tell you about shortly. My chemistry teacher praised my lab reports. I wasn't a student who struggled. I was a student who struggled specifically in one room, with one man, in a way that didn't add up. The writing competition was called the Ohio Valley Academic Excellence Essay Contest. I know that name sounds like something invented to pad a college application, but it mattered to our school. The previous year's winner had gotten a $10,000 scholarship and gone on to Oberlin. I'd been working on my entry for 2 months, a research essay on the legacy of the 1968 Democratic National Convention and its long-term effect on American political polarization. Mr. Bennett had read 4 drafts of it. He said it was the best student essay he'd read in 15 years of teaching. He submitted the paperwork for me to compete. 2 days before the submission deadline, I was called to the guidance counselor's office. A woman named Mrs. Turner sat across from me with the expression of someone delivering news they didn't choose to deliver. She explained that, due to a procedural issue, a conflict with my GPA threshold in a core AP course, I was technically ineligible to represent the school in the competition. The core AP course was AP History. The GPA threshold was 3.5. Collins had me at a 3.2. I asked if there was a review process. She said I'd have to discuss it with the teacher of record. I asked to speak to Collins. The meeting was 2 hours later, and it is among the clearest memories I own. He sat at his desk. I sat in the chair across from it. He had my file in front of him, but he didn't look at it. He looked at me with that same flat, measuring expression from the first week, and I suddenly had the irrational feeling that he'd been waiting for this meeting, like it was a destination he'd been navigating toward. I made my case carefully. I explained the essay, the scholarship, the work I'd put in. I asked if there was any way to review my grades, any assignment I could do to bring the average up before the deadline. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and then he said, "I grade on what I see. What I see in your work doesn't merit a higher score." He paused. "And I'll tell you something. Some students think intelligence is the same as insight. It isn't. You have the first. You don't yet have the second." He said it gently, clinically, like he was doing me a favor. I walked out of that office and stood in the hallway for a long time. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, not out of pride, but because what I felt wasn't grief. It was a cold, wordless thing. The first real encounter with the possibility that the world could be arranged against you by someone competent enough to make it look neutral. I was 16. I didn't have the language for that yet, but I felt the shape of it. I went home and said nothing to my parents. My mother had enough to worry about. My father would have gone to the school, and I knew instinctively that his going to the school would make things worse. Not because he would have been wrong to go, but because Collins was the kind of man who punished the escalation and called it standards. Mr. Bennett found out. He was furious in the quiet, professional way that good teachers are furious when the system fails a student they believed in. He wrote a formal letter of objection to the principal, citing the work's quality and questioning the timing of the grade review. Nothing came of it. The principal, whose name was Davis, was a man who regarded conflict as a weather event to be waited out. He thanked Mr. Bennett for his concern and did nothing. I finished my sophomore year and went into my junior year carrying something new. Not quite anger, more like a watchfulness, an inventory. I started paying attention to the room in a different way. I noticed things I'd missed before. One of the things I noticed was how Collins operated with the rest of the class. I want to be precise about this because it's important. He was genuinely good with most students. That's part of what made the targeting so difficult to name. He was engaging, intellectually rigorous, occasionally funny in the dry, sidelong way of someone who doesn't need to perform humor because they've always been the smartest person in the room. He remembered students' interests and referenced them. He wrote recommendation letters that, by all accounts, were better than anything else most of those students had in their application files. The parents loved him. The principal deferred to him. The other teachers treated him with a kind of weary respect, the kind you give to someone who makes the rest of you look less invested. His cruelty, and I'm going to use that word because the years have given me permission to be accurate, was surgical and narrow. It wasn't the broad-spectrum dismissiveness of a burned-out teacher who'd stopped caring. It was specific, calibrated. He could sit next to a student who wasn't one of us and spend 10 minutes helping them work through a primary source analysis with genuine patience, and then turn and dismiss one of us with a sentence so precisely targeted that it took 3 days to understand exactly how it had landed. I watched this dynamic for the entirety of junior year. I started keeping a private record, not a diary, not anything I'd ever show anyone, just a series of notes in a spiral notebook that I labeled History Projects on the outside cover in case anyone found it. Dates, incidents, what was said, who was present, what grade I'd received. It was the first time I'd tried to document something rather than simply experience it. I was 17, and I didn't know yet that what I was doing was building a case. I just knew that if I put it in writing, it was real, and if it was real, it could eventually be used. The spring of junior year brought something I hadn't expected, a class debate on the ethics of American interventionism in the post-Cold War period. It was, on paper, exactly the kind of assignment I was built for. Collins had structured it as a formal Oxford-style debate, 2 positions assigned randomly with points given for argumentation quality, use of evidence, and engagement with the opposing case. I was assigned to argue against interventionism. I prepared thoroughly, more thoroughly, I think, than anyone else in that room. I'd read 4 books outside of class, worked through Reagan-era policy documents that the school library had on microfilm, constructed an argument that moved through economic, historical, and ethical dimensions. The debate was graded in real time. Collins sat at the front with a rubric on his clipboard. He scored each contribution as it happened. I argued well. I know I argued well because 3 students came up to me after class and said so, including a girl named Heather, who was one of the strongest students in the room, and had no reason to flatter me. She said, "That was really good." "Did you do extra reading?" I said yes. She said, "It showed." My debate score was a 71 out of 100. The student who had argued the opposing position, a kid named Stephen, who was affable and enthusiastic and had prepared adequately but not exceptionally, received an 84. I requested a meeting to review my score. Collins showed me the rubric. He said I had been assertive without being persuasive, that I'd relied too heavily on documentation rather than rhetoric, and that my closing argument lacked synthesis. Each critique was technically coherent. Each one would have been difficult to argue against in isolation, Together, they added up to a score that didn't match what had happened in that room, and Collins knew it and I knew it, and we both sat there and let the space between those two knowledges go unaddressed. It was the last time I contested a grade with him directly. After that, I documented and moved on. I was building something, even if I didn't know what it was yet. There were 3 other students in Collins's classes who received the same treatment I did. Not the ordinary rigor he applied to everyone, the specific targeted diminishment. The first was a senior named Nathan, who was quiet and sharp and had Collins for government and politics. Nathan had transferred in from another district the year before I arrived. He had a way of holding himself. Straight-backed, eyes forward, the posture of someone who'd been taught not to flinch, that I recognized because I'd been told by my own father to stand the same way. Nathan was called on specifically to be corrected. His contributions were acknowledged with a kind of dismissal that left just enough plausible deniability to survive a complaint. The second was a sophomore named Brandon, who was in my grade but a different section. I only knew Brandon because we had lunch at the same time and sometimes ended up at the same table by default. He was quieter than Nathan, more internally bruised by it, I thought. He'd tell you things were fine when they weren't, but you could tell by the way his jaw sat when Collins's name came up. The third was a girl, a junior named Kimberly, who was in Collins's AP European History class. She was the one who actually said it out loud one day, sitting on the steps outside the gym, when several of us happened to overlap. She said, "Has anyone else noticed that Collins is different with certain people?" And there was a pause, and Nathan looked at her, and I looked at Nathan, and something unspoken moved through that circle of 3 or 4 kids that I can only describe as the relief of having a thought confirmed that you'd been afraid to say. We didn't turn it into a campaign. We were teenagers. We didn't know how. We just carried it together, which was better than carrying it alone. I noticed something else during that junior year that I've never been able to unnotice. The 3 of us, Nathan, Brandon, me, and Kimberly, once I looked more carefully, shared something physical. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd see in a photograph and point to. It was something in the geometry of the face. The eyes, specifically, a particular spacing, a particular line of the brow. I saw it most clearly one afternoon when I happened to see Nathan standing next to a group of kids who had no connection to Collins, and the difference was legible to me, in a way I couldn't explain and immediately dismissed as coincidence. I filed it away. I was 17. I had no framework for what it meant. What happened at the end of my junior year is the thing I've told people about the least, because it's the most embarrassing. Not morally embarrassing. I didn't do anything wrong, but the kind of embarrassing that comes from having believed, against all evidence, that the system would correct itself if you just made the right argument. There was a regional debate tournament. I joined the debate team in the spring of junior year as something of a survival strategy, a space where Collins had no jurisdiction. I was good at it. The coach, a woman named Mrs. Reynolds, who was the first person in that school to look at me like I had a future worth investing in, entered our team in the regional qualifying round. We won our first 2 rounds. We were scheduled to compete in the semifinal when Collins, who served on the school's academic review committee, flagged what he described as a scheduling conflict with a mandatory in-class assessment he'd scheduled for the same day. Mrs. Reynolds argued. She argued loudly and well and with documentation. The assessment had been scheduled after the tournament notice was posted. Collins acknowledged the overlap and said it was unintentional. He offered to reschedule, but only if other students with schedule conflicts could also be accommodated. And by the time that was all sorted out, the deadline to certify our team's roster had passed. I found out at 7 in the morning on the day of the tournament. Mrs. Reynolds called me before school and told me, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard before. Not just frustration, but something that sounded like helplessness, like she'd fought and lost something she'd expected to win. I went to school that day because I didn't know what else to do. I sat through Collins's class and said nothing. He taught the period as if nothing had happened. He was engaging and precise, and 3 students laughed at a joke he made about Woodrow Wilson. I sat in the back of the room and looked at the side of his face and felt something shift in me that I don't know how to name accurately. It wasn't hatred exactly. It was more like a closing, a door in me shutting, not in grief, but in decision. I didn't know yet what I was deciding, but something was decided. 2 weeks after the tournament, Nathan came to school and said he was transferring. His parents had enrolled him in a school on the other side of the county. He didn't explain why, and I didn't ask because I already knew. Kimberly transferred at the end of the semester. Brandon held on through senior year and graduated with grades that should have been better, and went to community college when he'd been capable of more, and me. My senior year began, and I was still there, and Collins was still there, and I had 1 year left. I told myself to keep my head down. I told myself I was almost through it. I told myself that the end of high school was a kind of exit velocity, that whatever happened inside those walls would matter less and less the faster I moved once I got out. I was wrong about that. The inside stays with you. That's the thing nobody warns you about. But I didn't know that yet. The final incident happened in February of my senior year. I'm going to tell it simply because the simple version is the true one, and I've spent enough time dressing it up in qualifications that protect other people's comfort. Collins was teaching a unit on American foreign policy in the Cold War. He asked a question about the Marshall Plan, specifically about the strategic motivations beyond the humanitarian framing. I raised my hand. He called on me. I answered. What I said was accurate, nuanced, and I know this because I've replayed it hundreds of times. It was the kind of answer a teacher who wanted to teach would build on. Instead, he said, "You've been reading things you don't understand and repeating them. That's not analysis, that's performance." He said it in his measured, professional tone. Not loud, not cruel in any way that a recording would capture, but the room was completely still. I said, "Can you tell me specifically what I got wrong?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "That's not how learning works. You don't get partial credit for almost understanding something." The laughter this time was larger, not the whole class, but enough. And there's something about the specific laughter of 17-year-olds in a room with an authority figure. It's a kind of endorsement. It tells you that the person with power has just been confirmed in their power by the people around you, and you are alone in that confirmation. I gathered my things and walked out of the class. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say anything else. I just left. He filed a disciplinary report. I received a 2-day suspension for leaving class without authorization. My mother was called. My father was called. My father came home from work early, left his route mid-delivery, which was something he never did, and sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked me what happened. I told him the whole thing. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to get out of here." And he said, "Okay, we figure out how." I graduated that spring with grades that were high enough to get me into a state university with a partial scholarship, but not high enough, because of Collins's class, to get me into the places I'd wanted. I had applied to 3 schools I was genuinely qualified for and been turned down by 2 of them. The rejection cited my GPA in core coursework, Collins's class, the 3.2 that had never moved. My graduation was a ceremony in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and anxiety. My parents sat in the bleachers, and my mother cried, and my father took photographs with a disposable camera that we got developed at the pharmacy 2 weeks later. I shook hands with Principal Davis, who told me I had a bright future in a tone that suggested he'd said the same thing 800 times before mine. I walked across the stage. I took my diploma, and I left that town driving my father's second car, which he'd put in my name, with $300 in a duffel bag and the overwhelming sense that I was escaping something that had already partially succeeded. I want to tell you about the next 10 years honestly. I'm going to resist the urge to make them into a montage, because they weren't a montage. They were long, specific, sometimes genuinely terrible, and sometimes small and ordinary, in ways that were their own kind of loss. I enrolled at Ohio State as an education major, partly out of genuine interest and partly out of a logic I couldn't fully articulate yet, that the space I'd been damaged in was the space I needed to understand. I was not a celebrated freshman. I was a student who worked 20 hours a week at a campus cafe, who lived in a studio apartment with another guy named Kevin, who worked nights at a warehouse, who ate the same 3 meals on rotation for 2 semesters because they were cheap enough that I didn't have to ask for anything. I was fine academically, not spectacular. I was too tired for spectacular during those first 2 years, but fine, engaged. My education professors were a mixed group, some of them the kind of teachers who made you understand why the profession existed, and some of them the kind who made you wonder if the institution had forgotten its own purpose. I paid attention to both kinds equally. I was building an inventory, though I didn't know that yet. I was fine academically, not spectacular. I was too tired for spectacular during those first 2 years, but fine, engaged. My education professors were a mixed group, some of them the kind of teachers who made you understand why the profession existed, and some of them the kind who made you wonder if the institution had forgotten its own purpose. I paid attention to both kinds equally. I was building an inventory, though I didn't know that yet. There was a professor in my second year named Dr. Graham who taught a seminar called Theory and Practice in Secondary Education. He was a small, precise man who had spent 11 years teaching in Cleveland's public school system before moving into academia, and he had the specific authority of someone who had survived the thing they were now teaching. He assigned us to observe 3 different secondary school classrooms over the course of the semester and write comparative analyses of the power dynamics we observed. Not the curriculum, not the test scores, but the relational structure, who spoke when, who was invited to speak, who was corrected and in what register, how authority was deployed, and whether it was deployed in service of learning or in service of compliance. I did my 3 observations. I also did 2 additional ones at schools I'd found on my own, because by that point the exercise had become personal in a way I hadn't anticipated. I was watching for a specific thing, the thing I'd experienced with Collins but hadn't yet been able to name precisely. And over those 5 observations I found it twice. Teachers who were, in their different ways, using the classroom not as a space of learning, but as a space of self-reinforcement. Not villains, not monsters. People who had somewhere in the geography of their careers shifted from teaching the subject to teaching their own primacy, and who couldn't fully see that the shift had happened because the students who suffered most from it were also the least likely to be believed if they named it. I wrote a 20-page analysis that semester. Dr. Graham gave me the highest grade in the class and then, after returning it, kept me after class to ask me where it came from. I said I had personal experience with the dynamic I was describing. He said, "Do you plan to teach?" I said yes. He said, "Good. We need people who understand this from the inside." He paused. "Just don't let it make you angry instead of careful. Angry teachers don't change systems. Careful ones do." I carried that sentence through the next decade. Some days it kept me steady. Some days I wondered if being careful was just another word for being patient with something that didn't deserve patience. The first time I seriously doubted myself, not the ordinary doubt of a 20-year-old, but the deep, structural doubt, was in my second year of college, during a seminar on pedagogy and power dynamics in education. The professor, whose name was Dr. Wallace, was the first person I'd encountered in an academic setting who talked about what teachers can do to students the way a doctor talks about pathology, clinically, seriously, without euphemism. He assigned readings about coercive authority, about grade manipulation as a control mechanism, about the specific damage done when a student's instinct to engage is repeatedly punished. I sat in that class and felt seen and sick at the same time, because the intellectual framework that explained what Collins had done to me also made me aware, in a new way, of how successfully it had worked. I wasn't the reader I'd been at 15. I was more guarded, more strategic in what I said. I'd learned to pre-evaluate how much of myself to put into a room before I put it in. That isn't something that happens to a confident person. That's something that happens to someone who's been taught that expression is a risk. I went back to my apartment after that class and sat in my car in the parking lot for 45 minutes. Just sat there, processing something I didn't have the language for yet. The something was this: that I had made a very large, strategic mistake. I had spent 3 years in high school interpreting Collins' behavior as a problem I needed to solve through performance, through getting better grades, through being more precise, through proving him wrong on his own terms. And in doing so, I had allowed his terms to become mine. I had let his evaluation of me enter the place where my own evaluation should have been. That's the specific damage, not the grades, not the missed competitions. The damage is interior. The damage is that you start to mistake his voice for your own. And once that's happened, it takes a long time to untangle whose thoughts you're actually having. I carried that understanding quietly for a long time. I graduated with my education degree in 4 years, and I want to tell you what I did next, because this is the part that people skip when they tell the short version. The short version says, he built something successful and came back. The long version says, for 4 years after graduation, he built almost nothing and lived in the specific American limbo of someone who knows what they want but hasn't yet found the mechanism. I moved to Columbus. I got a teaching job at a public middle school in a district that needed bodies in classrooms. I was 23 years old and standing in front of 30 kids who had exactly the same posture I'd had in Collins' class. Watchful, guarded, waiting to see if this was a room where safety was possible. I wasn't a bad teacher. I want to be precise about that. I was a young teacher who was better than some and worse than others and was learning in real time what the profession actually required. I moved to Columbus. I got a teaching job at a public middle school in a district that needed bodies in classrooms. I was 23 years old and standing in front of 30 kids who had exactly the same posture I'd had in Collins' class. Watchful, guarded, waiting to see if this was a room where safety was possible. I wasn't a bad teacher. I want to be precise about that. I was a young teacher who was better than some and worse than others, and was learning in real time what the profession actually required. The students at that school were the first thing that made me genuinely glad I'd made the choice I'd made. Not the institution. The institution was underfunded and administratively chaotic in ways that would eventually grind down teachers who'd entered it with more idealism than structural understanding. But the kids, 12 and 13 and 14 years old, navigating the specific complexity of that age with the tools available to them, which were often not very many. I had a student named Eric who read 2 grades ahead of his level and was failing every class because nobody had figured out that he was bored rather than disengaged. I had a student named Allison who was visibly terrified of being called on, and who blossomed slowly over the course of the year when I made it a policy in my classroom that you could always pass on a spoken answer if you submitted a written one. I had 47 students that first year who taught me, across 9 months of practice, more about what a classroom could be than my entire education degree had managed. I want to tell you about the specific day I understood what I needed to build. It was a Thursday in March of my second teaching year. I was reviewing a student's grade with the school's academic coordinator, a process that existed, technically, as a check on teacher discretion. In practice, it was a rubber stamp. The student's name was Megan, and she was a 7th grader who had written an essay that was, by any reasonable measure, exceptional for her age, genuinely exceptional, the kind of work that makes a teacher pay attention. Her English teacher had given it a C+. When I looked at the teacher's rubric notes, they said the essay lacked structure and relied too heavily on personal experience. When I read the essay, I saw a kid who had used her personal experience as a structural foundation for an argument, which is a sophisticated choice that the rubric hadn't been built to recognize. I raised the issue in the review meeting. The academic coordinator, a man named Kevin, who had been in the district for 20 years, and carried the particular tiredness of someone who had filed 1,000 similar objections, said, "The teacher's grade stands unless there's a procedural error." I said there was a rubric misapplication. He said the teacher had discretion over rubric interpretation. I said the discretion was producing a result that didn't match the work's quality. He said, "I understand your concern," in the tone of someone who has stopped understanding concerns professionally. I drove home that day with the specific frustration of someone who can see the problem with complete clarity and has no mechanism to address it. And I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about what I would need to build for there to be a mechanism, not a complaint process, not a review committee, a fundamental architecture, a school where the review was built in from the beginning, where the teacher's evaluation was genuinely bidirectional, where a student like Megan had actual recourse, and not just the theoretical recourse that felt like justice and functioned like nothing. That's when it started becoming real. Not as a dream or a plan, as a technical problem I was going to solve, but I was also broke in a way that was starting to feel structural. My salary was $38,000 a year. After rent and my student loan payment and the basic costs of being a functioning adult, I had somewhere between $200 and $400 left per month, depending on what broke or got sick. I drove a 2003 Honda Civic that I'd bought with a personal loan at a terrible interest rate, and I had one pair of dress shoes that I resoled twice before I finally admitted they were finished. This isn't a poverty narrative. I've known people with much less and much harder, but I want you to understand that the version of me at 24, 25, 26 was not the version of me in the headlines. I was invisible in the specific way that young teachers in under-resourced schools are invisible. Present, necessary, unrecognized, slowly running down. The mistake I made during this period, and I said earlier that there would be one major strategic mistake, and this is it, was that I spent 2 years trying to reform from within. I believed, and this is the specific naivety of someone who entered education as an act of corrective faith, that the problem with schools, like the one I'd come from, was a problem that could be fixed through better practice inside the existing structure. I wrote a proposal for a student feedback system in my second year. I presented it to my principal, a woman named Claire, who was well-meaning and administratively overwhelmed, and she praised it and filed it, and nothing happened. I tried to build a coalition of teachers who wanted to change how evaluations worked. 3 of them were interested. 2 of them eventually stopped coming to the meetings because the meetings were in their unpaid time and they were exhausted. I wasted 2 years trying to move a structure that wasn't designed to move, and the cost of that mistake was time. In the world I eventually built, time is the only thing you can't buy back. I spent 2 years of it on a path that was never going to lead where I needed to go. What changed things was a conversation with a man I barely knew. His name was Andrew, and he was a parent of one of my students. A quiet, capable kid named Matthew, who was doing badly in school, for reasons that had nothing to do with Matthew's capability, and everything to do with the fact that nobody had figured out how Matthew learned. Andrew came in for a parent-teacher conference, and I told him honestly what I'd observed about his son, and he looked at me across the desk and said, "Why does the system work the way it does?" And I said, "Because no one with money has decided it should work differently." And he said, "What would you do if you had the money?" And I told him about transparency in teacher-student relationships. I told him about structured feedback cycles, about the importance of students having agency in their own assessment, about what schools looked like when they were built around the specific needs of specific students instead of the administrative convenience of a system that treated kids as data points. I talked for almost 40 minutes. Andrew sat and listened. At the end, he said, "I went to business school. I know about building things. You should come have dinner with my wife and me." I want to be clear. Andrew was not my benefactor. He wasn't a wealthy angel who funded my dream. He was a man who happened to know other people, and who put me in rooms with those people, and who told me that what I was describing was a market gap, not just a pedagogical theory. That framing, market gap, was something I needed to hear in the language I needed to hear it in, because I'd been speaking the language of reform for 2 years, and it hadn't opened any doors. I started doing the research at night. After my students went home and my lesson plans were done, I sat at my kitchen table and I studied. I read about private school models, about charter school funding, about the economics of tuition, about how endowments worked, about what it cost to build a facility versus convert one. I read about nonprofit law. I read about curriculum design. I read about everything I didn't know, and I made lists of what I needed to learn, and I learned it. This went on for 2 years. I was 28 when I first drafted what eventually became the operating framework of the Larson Academy, though it had a different name then, and it was 45 pages of dense ideas that needed 10 more passes before they became anything buildable. I left teaching at 29, not dramatically. I finished the school year, thanked my students, thanked Claire, who I genuinely liked, and left. I moved into a smaller apartment in a cheaper neighborhood. I got a job as an education consultant, a real one, working for a firm that advised school districts on curriculum alignment. It paid more than teaching. I was good at it. But more importantly, it put me in rooms with the people who made decisions, and I watched how those decisions were made, and I saved money, and I kept working on my own framework on evenings and weekends. I was 31 when I met a woman named Stephanie, who was a partner at a private equity firm that had made 2 investments in education technology companies. I met her through Andrew at one of his dinner parties, and I pitched my idea to her over the second glass of wine without fully meaning to, and she listened with the specific attention of someone doing real-time math. She said, "Come back to me with a full financial model and a site study." I spent 4 months on the financial model. I hired a real estate consultant named Sean, who'd worked on school construction projects and knew what sites were viable. I built projections, conservative ones, because I was not going to stand in front of a serious person and tell them I was projecting optimistically. I went back to Stephanie with 90 pages and a site proposal and a 5-year model that showed a path to operational sustainability without depending on external funding past the initial capital raise. She brought in 2 co-investors. They funded the first phase of construction. I was 32 years old, and I had enough money to start building something real for the first time in my life. And I want to be honest with you about what that felt like. It felt like standing at the edge of something enormous and being unsure whether the ground was solid. Not triumphant, not vindicated, not yet. It felt like being one wrong decision away from having proven Collins right. That I had performance without insight, that I was reaching beyond my actual capacity. That voice, that specific Collins voice doubt, was the thing I had to manage the hardest during those years, because it sounded like mine. He'd done his work well enough that I couldn't always tell the difference between legitimate caution and internalized contempt. And when you're making decisions at scale, when real money and real people's livelihoods are dependent on the quality of your judgment, you cannot afford to be uncertain about whose voice is running in the background. The Larson Academy opened its doors for the first cohort of students 4 years after the initial funding round. 120 students, grades 6 through 12, in a converted warehouse in the Arts District of Columbus that we'd renovated over 18 months with an architect named Victoria, who became one of my most important early hires, because she understood that the building itself was an argument about what education should feel like. Open, transparent, literally walls of glass between spaces rather than solid partitions, accountable in both directions. I need to tell you what those 18 months of renovation felt like, because it was during that period that I understood something important about the nature of what I was doing. It wasn't just construction. It wasn't just institution building. Every decision, the sight lines between classrooms, the placement of the feedback terminals in the hallways, the design of the student resource rooms that were intentionally made more physically generous than the administrative offices. Every one of those decisions was a deliberate inversion of the school I'd come from. I wasn't just building something new. I was building something as a structural argument against something old. And the argument was in the architecture itself, not in any statement I'd ever need to make publicly. Victoria understood this without my fully explaining it. She'd been a school architect for 12 years, and she said to me once, over blueprints at 9 o'clock at night, most clients want the building to express what they do. You want it to express what they shouldn't do. I said that was about right. She said, that's actually easier to design. Negatives are more precise than positives. I thought about that a lot in the months that followed. Every teacher at Larson signed a professional covenant that included student feedback as a formal part of their evaluation. Every grade was subject to a structured appeal process with a third-party academic reviewer. We published our curriculum online. We published our teacher evaluations with identifying details removed. We published our funding sources. I had lived in a school built on the quiet exercise of unchecked authority, and I was building the opposite. The first year was hard in ways I'd anticipated and hard in ways I hadn't. The anticipated difficulties were financial and operational, the unexpected cost overruns, the staffing challenges, the parents who wanted something different than what we'd promised, and needed to be shown the value of what we'd built instead. The unanticipated difficulty was emotional. I was running a school. I was inside a school every day. I was watching students sit in rooms with teachers and navigating the specific power dynamics I'd built this institution to correct. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, I'd see a teacher default to the old mode, the one where authority reasserts itself at the expense of the student, and I'd have to sit in a room with that teacher and explain, calmly and without being cruel, what I'd seen and what it needed to look like instead. Those conversations were not easy. They required me to be the kind of fair that I hadn't been shown. That's the thing about being shaped by injustice. It gives you extraordinary clarity about what injustice looks like, and it does not automatically give you extraordinary skill at justice. Those are different things. I had to learn the second one deliberately. We ended our first year with a 94% parent satisfaction rate and a waiting list of 200 students. Our second year, we expanded to a second building and added a middle school cohort. By year 3, we had a small but growing endowment, 3 board members with genuine national education credentials, and a press profile in a regional magazine that caught the attention of a journalist in Columbus named Amanda Simmons, who would later become important in ways I couldn't have predicted. I was 36 years old when the invitation came to open the second campus. Not a second Larson Academy, a new model we were calling the Larson Institute, a hybrid college preparation and community-based learning center in a mid-sized city in Indiana. The investors for this one were partly drawn from our original circle and partly from a new group that Stephanie had brought in after seeing the first campus's metrics. The Indiana site required a formal announcement event, a ribbon cutting, a press presence, speeches, donors. It required me to stand up in front of a room of people who had backed this vision and say clearly and publicly what I had built and why. I spent 6 weeks on that speech, not the words. I always knew the words, but the framing. the decision about how much of the origin story to include. I had never publicly discussed Collins. I had never discussed the specific experience that had shaped my philosophy of institutional accountability. I'd spoken around it in interviews, formative experiences, a deep interest in how power operates in educational spaces, the kind of language that gestures at a wound without opening it. The Larson Institute's opening was the moment when I seriously considered changing that. I didn't change it, not then. I stood at the podium and spoke about the vision and the students and the research and the investors, and I said nothing about the room in Ohio, where a man had systematically dismantled my engagement with learning because of something I didn't yet understand. The speech was received well. I smiled and shook hands and answered questions. And I drove home afterward in a rental car in the Indiana rain, and felt the particular hollowness of a victory that hasn't been witnessed by the person who made it necessary. That hollowness is something I need to be honest about. By 36, I was financially stable in a way I'd never expected. Not wealthy in the way people imagine when they think about success stories, but secure in a way that felt profound, given where I'd started. I had a one-bedroom apartment in Columbus that I owned outright. I had no debt. I had a professional identity that people respected. I had staff who trusted me, and students whose trajectory I'd genuinely changed, and investors who considered me credible. I had everything that the external markers of a well-built life are supposed to deliver, and I was alone in a way that felt structural. I'd had 2 serious relationships in my 30s. Both of them ended with the same explanation, articulated in different ways by 2 different people, that I was present for everyone at work and somehow absent for the person across from me at dinner, that I cared about students I'd never met more visibly than I cared about the people who were actually in my life. One of the women I'd been with, whose name was Laura and who was one of the most perceptive people I've known, said to me once, "You know what you're protecting people from at that school, but I don't think you know what you're protecting yourself from." I didn't have an answer. I've thought about that sentence almost every day since. I want to be clear that this cost, the isolation, the difficulty of genuine intimacy, the way my emotional availability had become professionally directed and personally restricted. I do not blame entirely on Collins. I was not a helpless vessel shaped only by one man. I made choices. I prioritized the work. I found meaning in the institution in ways that substituted for meaning I should have been finding elsewhere. Some of that was temperament. Some of it was the specific shape of the wound. But I'd be lying if I said there was no connection. The press profile that Amanda Simmons wrote in year 3 had generated enough national attention that when we announced the Indiana expansion, we had journalists from 3 national outlets requesting interviews. One of them worked for an education-focused publication that did long-form narrative pieces. She was a reporter named Danielle Foster, and she was the kind of journalist who did real research before she sat down with you. She'd read every public document associated with Larson Academy. She'd interviewed 3 of my teachers, and 2 of my board members and 4 parents before she called me. She asked smart questions, and at the end of a 2-hour interview, she asked the question I'd been waiting for someone to ask for years. She said, "Where does the intensity of your commitment to institutional accountability come from? It's consistent across everything you've built." There's a philosophical clarity to it that most founders don't have. Did something happen? I paused for a long time. Then I said, "I'll answer that at some point. I'm not ready yet." She respected that. She published her piece. It was good. It ran in a national education journal and was read by, among other people, a man in Central Ohio who had, by that point, retired from his position at Denison High School and was living in the same town I'd grown up in and teaching occasional adjunct courses at a community college. I know this because his wife saw the article and showed it to him. I know this because 3 months after the article ran, I received a handwritten letter. I'd gotten mail at the academy before. The institution was public-facing enough that letters arrived occasionally from strangers, but this one I almost didn't open because I didn't recognize the return address. When I opened it, I stood in my office for a long time before I sat down. The letter was from Collins. It was 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged, obliquely and with more qualifications than a direct admission, that he was aware his treatment of certain students during his career had perhaps not reflected the best pedagogical judgment. The second described what he was going through, the suggestion that his life had narrowed since retirement, that his professional legacy wasn't what he'd expected it to be. The third expressed what he called a desire for resolution. I read it 4 times. Each time I felt something different. First, the immediate visceral recognition of his voice, which I could hear in the cadence of his sentences. Then something colder and more analytical. I thought about what it meant that he'd written this, what it told me about where he was and what he believed I might do with it. And I thought about the specific word he'd used. Resolution, not apology, not accountability, resolution. The word of a man who wants the discomfort to end, not the record corrected. I did not write back. I hired a private investigator 6 weeks later. Not immediately. I sat with the decision for 6 weeks, because I'd spent enough time in institutional context to understand that how you gather information determines what you're able to do with it. The investigator I hired was a woman named Rebecca Hayes, who had worked previously in education law and ran her own practice in Columbus. I told her what I was looking for. I told her the specific pattern I'd observed in high school, the students Collins targeted, the physical similarities, the cascade of transfers. I told her about Nathan and Brandon and Kimberly. I told her what I remembered about their features, their posture, the specific way they carried themselves. Rebecca was thorough. That's the only word for it. She was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they've spent a career handling things that are complicated and uncomfortable and require precision. She took 4 months. She found 7 names, 7 students, across Collins's 31-year career at Denison High School. 7 students who had been systematically targeted with a pattern that matched my own experience exactly. The grade suppression, the public undermining, the manufactured ineligibility for opportunities. 7 students who had in common not just the treatment, but the specific physical characteristics I'd described to Rebecca. 7 students who, when she quietly and carefully reached out to them with the offer of a confidential conversation, each had something to tell her. Rebecca presented her findings to me on a Tuesday morning in her office. She sat across from me and spoke in the measured tone of someone who has learned to deliver difficult information professionally, and as she spoke, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not even anger, something closer to grief. The grief that comes from having a suspicion confirmed that you'd spent years hoping was wrong. She said, "I think you already know what the pattern suggests." I said, "Tell me what the evidence suggests." She told me that of the 7 students, she'd been able to obtain DNA samples from 5 who'd agreed to testing. She said she had a contact in Ohio's vital records who had helped her locate information that, while not conclusive on its own, was strongly corroborating. She said the testing, if it confirmed what the other evidence suggested, would need to be independently verified before it could be used in any legal or public context. She said that she wanted me to be prepared for the possibility that the outcome of this investigation was going to be something I couldn't take back once I knew it. I said I understood. I authorized the full investigation, the DNA. Testing took 8 weeks. The results came back in a clinical report that I read alone in my apartment at 11 o'clock at night. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop and sat in my kitchen for a long time. I want to be clear about what I felt, because people have asked me, and I've given different versions of the answer, depending on who was asking. The clearest version is this: I felt confirmed in something I'd always sensed, and the confirmation didn't bring relief. It brought a cold, clarifying recognition of the full geometry of the thing, not just what he'd done to me, but why, and what the why meant about every choice he'd made in that room, in that school, across 31 years of standing at the front of classrooms and doing what I'd experienced to each of us in turn. He had known. The features I'd recognized, the posture I'd shared with Nathan and Brandon. We had all been his children, born by different women, unacknowledged, and he had known it. He'd known when he looked at us across his classroom, and he had punished us, not despite that knowledge, but because of it. We were the evidence of his failures, the physical proof of a life conducted without accountability, and he had addressed that proof the only way a man in his position could address it without anyone asking the right questions. He'd made us small. He'd made us doubt ourselves. He'd used the authority the institution had given him to ensure that we would either disappear or diminish. I thought about Nathan, who had transferred and then, based on Rebecca's research, had gone to work in construction and never gone to college. I thought about Brandon, who had gone to community college with grades that should have taken him further, and had spent his 20s in a series of jobs that didn't match what I'd seen in him at 17. I thought about Kimberly, whose mother, Rebecca had found this, had been a teacher's aide at Denison for 3 years, overlapping exactly with a specific period in Collins's life that I don't need to detail here, for you to understand the shape of it. I thought about my mother. That's the part that took the longest to hold, because my mother was not a stranger in a pattern. She was the woman who had packed my lunch and come to my school plays and cried at my graduation, and the revelation didn't change any of that. But it added a dimension to every memory that I had no preparation for and no roadmap through. I didn't ask her directly. Not then. That conversation was going to require a level of care that I wasn't able to provide, while I was still in the middle of processing what I knew. I hired a therapist, which was something I'd avoided for years, because I'd been raised in the particular culture where doing so signals weakness, and I'd absorbed that signal more deeply than I'd realized. His name was Dr. Mitchell, and he was, to be plainly honest with you, one of the most important people in the next chapter of my life. I also started planning. The planning had 2 tracks. The first was public and institutional. I had spent 4 years building a professional reputation in the education space. I had relationships with journalists, with education attorneys, with advocacy organizations. I had Rebecca's investigative record, which was rigorous enough to withstand scrutiny. I knew that what I'd uncovered had a story structure that a journalist like Amanda or Danielle would recognize immediately. A story about systematic abuse of institutional authority, about a pattern of behavior hidden in plain sight, about the specific damage done to children by the adults entrusted with their development. The story wasn't mine alone. It was 7 people's story, and it was the story of the mothers who had been silenced. The second track was personal and symbolic. I had always understood, at some level, that the truest form of accountability for what Collins had done was not legal but architectural. Not what happened to him in a courtroom, but what happened to the space he'd built his identity in. He had built himself inside a school. His legacy, such as it was institutional. He'd spent 31 years accruing the specific authority of a teacher who was respected and feared, and consulted and deferred to. To take that architecture apart, not by slander, but by building something in its place that made the contrast undeniable, that was the ending I'd been moving toward without fully knowing it. I contacted Amanda Simmons first. She came to my office and I told her the story, all of it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "This needs to be reported correctly. It's not just your story." I said, "I know, that's why I'm bringing it to you." We spent 3 weeks developing the approach together, identifying which elements were legally established, which were Rebecca's investigative record, which required additional verification. Amanda brought in a colleague, a legal journalist named Patrick Bennett who had covered institutional abuse cases before. They were careful in the way that serious journalism is careful, and I'm grateful for that, because the story deserved precision. But before any of it became public, I got a phone call. It came on a Thursday morning. My phone showed an Ohio area code I didn't recognize. I answered it, because I always answer unknown numbers. The voice on the other end was Collins. He had found my number. I'd been listed in some professional directory, or someone had passed it along. I don't know. His voice was exactly as I remembered it. Measured, professional. The voice of a man who was accustomed to controlling the register of a conversation. He said he was calling because he felt that a personal conversation would be more appropriate than written correspondence. He said that given my recent professional success, he felt it was time to revisit some of the dynamics of my high school experience and arrive at a mutual understanding. I listened to the entire thing. Then I said, "I appreciate you calling. I'd actually like to invite you to an event at the end of next month. We're opening a new facility in Columbus. I'd like you to be there." There was a pause. He said, "I'm not sure I understand the invitation." I said, "It's an open event, public. There will be press there. I'd like to acknowledge the people who shaped my understanding of education. I think your presence would be appropriate." Another pause, longer this time. Then he said, "I'll consider it." He came. I didn't expect that, actually. I thought he might, but I wasn't certain, and there was something in his decision to come that told me something important about who he was, that after everything, he was still curious about his own place in my narrative, still wanted to be in the room where the story was being told, still believed on some level that he could manage what happened there. The opening of the Larson Institute's Columbus campus was a significant event by the standards of the regional education community. 200 guests, local press, a state senator who sent a representative in her place, the kind of gathering that signals institutional legitimacy in a particular register, not glamorous but serious, purposeful. I had made sure the space itself was right. The renovated building at the corner of 4th and Market, 3 floors of glass and reclaimed wood, and wide corridors that felt nothing like the low-ceilinged institutional space of a public school. The kind of space that says, with its architecture alone, this was built for people. I saw him enter about 45 minutes into the reception. He was older than I remembered him. The breadth of his shoulders had diminished. His hair was fully gray, but he still walked with the same posture, straight, deliberate, the body language of a man who has always known he was the most credentialed person in the room. He wore a dark jacket and a tie. He'd made an effort. That detail registered. I continued the conversations I was having. I didn't cross the room immediately. I let him exist in the space for 20 minutes while I spoke with donors, with teachers, with a journalist who wanted to talk about the curriculum design. I was aware of where he was at all times. I want to be honest about that. I was tracking him the way you track something significant in a room where the stakes are high. The opening of the Larson Institute's Columbus campus was a significant event by the standards of the regional education community. 200 guests, local press, a state senator who sent a representative in her place. The kind of gathering that signals institutional legitimacy in a particular register. Not glamorous, but serious, purposeful. I had made sure the space itself was right. The renovated building at the corner of 4th and Market, 3 floors of glass and reclaimed wood and wide corridors that felt nothing like the low-ceilinged institutional space of a public school. The kind of space that says, with its architecture alone, this was built for people. I spent the first hour of the reception moving through the room the way I'd learned to move through rooms over years of running an institution, present but not performing, genuinely interested in the people I was talking to, collecting the ambient information of how the event was landing. I spoke with 2 of the Larson Foundation's longest-serving board members, a woman named Rachel Anderson, who had been on the board since the original funding round, and who had the specific kind of institutional loyalty that comes from having seen something fragile become something solid. I spoke with a group of teachers from our first campus who'd come because they were proud of what the expansion represented. I spoke with a journalist named Brian from a national education publication who wanted to do a follow-up profile on the foundation and whose questions were good enough that I spent 20 minutes with him when I'd planned for 10. And across all of it, I was aware of Collins. I'd caught him when he entered. He came in through the main door at 43 minutes past the opening, which told me something about the calculation he'd made. Not so early that it looked eager, not so late that it looked reluctant. He'd timed it. Of course he had. He was still a man who managed entrances. I let him exist in the room without acknowledging him for 20 minutes. I want to be honest about why. Partly because I was genuinely engaged in other conversations, and partly because I wanted him to experience the full texture of being in a space that was mine, having to navigate it on my terms, without the immediate acknowledgement that would have restored the dynamic between us to something more familiar. I wanted him to stand in a building I had built, surrounded by people who had come because of what I'd made, and to feel the specific shift in gravity that happens when you've spent your life being the most significant person in a room, and you realize you're not anymore. When I finally moved toward him, it was because he'd moved toward me first. We met near the north wall, in front of a large framed photograph of the school's first cohort. 72 students of various ages, all of them looking directly at the camera with the particular expression of children who have been told they belong somewhere and have started to believe it. He shook my hand. His grip was firm. He looked at me the way he'd always looked at me, measuring, assessing, running some interior calculus. He said, "You've built something impressive." I said, "I have." There was a beat. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. White, business-sized. He held it out and said, "You always wanted the truth." I took it. I didn't open it immediately. I held it at my side and kept my eyes on him. He said, "There are things you deserve to know. I'm giving them to you directly, as I should have done years ago." I said, "I know what's in here." His expression shifted, very slightly. The first time in my memory that I'd seen something uncontrolled move across his face, he said, "Then you understand why I said, "I do." He started to speak. I turned away and rejoined the event. I know how that reads. I want to explain it. The choice to turn away wasn't cruelty, or it wasn't only cruelty. It was a recognition that I'd already done the work he thought he was about to do. He believed he was bringing me a revelation. He believed he was holding the power in that envelope, that the information inside it was his to deploy, his final control over the shape of my story. And by showing him, calmly, without drama, without the confrontation he'd been half expecting, that I'd already been there, that I already knew, I removed the last piece of authority he thought he had over me. That was intentional. I want to own it. What I didn't know and learn the next morning was what he'd done after leaving the opening. He went to my father's house. I've had a year to understand this decision, to sit with the psychology of it, to try to make sense of why he did it. The best I can arrive at is that it was the last move available to a man whose other moves had been neutralized. He had come to the opening expecting confrontation or reconciliation or some version of an exchange that still placed him at the center of the story. Instead, he'd been received and dismissed. So he went to the one place where he still had a weapon, the information itself, and he used it. My father was 71 years old. He was living alone since my mother's health had declined enough that she'd moved closer to her sister in Toledo. He was in the house where he'd lived for 40 years, in the town where he'd spent his working life, the same man I'd always known, the one who drove the delivery route and came home asking about my day and took photographs at my graduation with a disposable camera. Collins knocked on his door and told him everything. I got the call from my father at 6:30 the next morning. He didn't explain anything on the phone. He just said, "I need you to come." In the 22 years I'd been an adult, he had asked me that once before, when my mother was hospitalized. I was in the car within the hour. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I arrived. He had coffee in front of him, but he wasn't drinking it. He looked at me when I came in, and I could see that something had gone out of him. Not all of it, but a significant piece. The piece that is built from understanding the shape of your own life. He said he came here last night, a man named Collins. And then he told me what Collins had told him. He told it the way my father tells everything. Factually, without embellishment, because that's the kind of man he is. He said Collins had described the affair with my mother. He said Collins had described it in specific detail, the kind of detail that serves no purpose except to wound. He said Collins had told him, directly and without apparent emotion, that my father had raised another man's son and never known it. My father finished telling me, and then sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "Is it true?" I said, "Yes." He sat with that. I didn't fill the silence. I've learned, in the years of running an institution, that some silences need to be left alone. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Months." He said, "You didn't tell me." I said, "I was trying to figure out how." He said, "Okay." Then he stood up and told me he needed to take a walk. He put on his coat and walked out the back door into the yard. I watched him from the kitchen window. He walked to the far end of the yard, where there's an old oak tree that's been there longer than the house, and he stood there for a while with his hands in his pockets. And then he walked back inside. He didn't leave. I need to tell you that. The version that got out, that he walked out on the family, that the home collapsed, that version is partially true and partially the shape of a story people need to tell. What's true is that my parents' marriage did not survive what came next. My mother, when she learned what Collins had done, and that my father had been told, went through her own reckoning. That was hers to have, not mine to narrate. My parents separated in the months following, and it was painful in the way that the ending of a 40-year partnership is always painful, even when the reasons are understandable and the love was real. But my father did not leave me. I want to be precise about that. He came to the Larson Academy's spring celebration 6 months later. He sat in the front row. He told me afterward that the building was something to be proud of. He is 72 years old, and he is the man who raised me, and he is still the man I call first when something important happens. I tell you this because the story needs to include that. The damage Collins did was real. It was significant. It took pieces of things that were good and irreplaceable. But it did not take everything it reached for. That matters. What happened in the weeks after Collins' visit to my father's house was both public and private, and I'll give you both. On the private side, I called Rebecca. I told her what Collins had done. I told her I wanted to proceed with everything we'd discussed. The full investigative disclosure, the journalist contacts, the legal consultations with the families of the other students. Rebecca said, "Are you sure you're ready for the scale of what happens next?" I said yes. She said, "Okay, let's build it properly." On the public side, Amanda's reporting ran 6 weeks later. The piece was called The Grade Book, a title that, in retrospect, understated the scope of what it contained. It documented the pattern across Collins's career, the specific students, the grade manipulation, the manufactured ineligibilities, the cascade of transfers. It documented Rebecca's investigative work. It included, with the consent of 4 of the 7 students, their own accounts of what Collins had done to them. It included the DNA testing results, verified by an independent laboratory. It included a statement from the Ohio Department of Education, which had opened a preliminary review of Collins' service record. On the public side, Amanda's reporting ran 6 weeks later. The piece was called The Grade Book, a title that, in retrospect, understated the scope of what it contained. It documented the pattern across Collins's career, the specific students, the grade manipulation, the manufactured ineligibilities, the cascade of transfers. It documented Rebecca's investigative work. It included, with the consent of 4 of the 7 students, their own accounts of what Collins had done to them. It included the DNA testing results, verified by an independent laboratory. It included a statement from the Ohio Department of Education, which had opened a preliminary review of Collins's service record. I want to tell you what it was like to read that piece before it ran. Amanda sent me the final draft for factual review, which is standard practice, and I read it in my office with the door closed. It was 11,000 words. It opened with Nathan's account of his junior year and moved chronologically through 5 other stories, including mine, before arriving at the systemic analysis. The pattern across 3 decades, the institutional mechanisms that had allowed it to persist, the specific failures of oversight that had made it possible for a man in Collins' position to use the authority of his role as a weapon without anyone aggregating the evidence. What Amanda had done, and this is what separated her piece from what it could have been, was decline to make it a story about a monster. She'd made it a story about a system. Collins was the central figure, but the piece was structured around the question of how something this sustained goes unaddressed for 30 years, and the answer was institutional, the siloed nature of school records, the professional discretion afforded to tenured teachers, the reluctance of parents to challenge someone with Collins's reputation, the specific difficulty of students naming coercive authority when the coercion is conducted within the normal parameters of academic evaluation. He'd known exactly how much room he had. He'd operated precisely within it. That's what I'd been trying to build against all along, not Collins specifically, the room he'd been given. Amanda wrote the story with precision and without sensationalism. She let the facts do the thing that facts, when properly assembled, do. They made the shape of the man visible in a way that no single incident could have. 31 years of being the most respected man in a particular room. 31 years of knowing what he'd scattered across those rooms and using the authority the institution had given him to ensure it stayed invisible. The story ran in a national outlet and was picked up by 14 others within 48 hours. The legal action followed within 2 weeks. A Columbus-based civil rights attorney named Gregory Turner organized a collective lawsuit on behalf of 5 of the 7 students and 2 of the mothers. The lawsuit cited emotional abuse, grade manipulation, and abuse of institutional authority. It was a complex case. Some of the conduct was outside the statute of limitations, some was not. But the filing itself was enough to trigger a formal investigation by the Ohio Department of Education. Collins's professional awards were reviewed by the 3 educational organizations that had granted them. 2 revoked them within 6 weeks. The 3rd issued a statement saying the recognition had been for specific curriculum contributions rather than general professional conduct, which was the kind of legal hedging that tells you everything you need to know about how institutions protect themselves. His wife, I'll call her by no name because she deserves her privacy in this, and she was not part of what he built, learned about the multiple children from the reporting. I know this because Amanda told me, and because the information was documented in the public record within days of the story running. She left him. She took their daughter and moved to Indiana. I don't know anything beyond that, and I'm not going to speculate about the interior of a life I haven't lived. Collins's community college appointment was not renewed the following semester. His name was removed from the Denison High School Hall of Achievement, which is a display case in the front hallway of the school containing photographs and citations for alumni and staff who had, in the school's determination, brought distinction to the institution. I wasn't involved in that decision. It was made by the incoming principal, a woman named Nicole Davis, who had come up through the district and who issued a 2-sentence statement saying the school had a responsibility to accurately represent its history. I bought the Denison High School building 8 months later. The school had been consolidated into a larger district facility 2 years earlier, and the building, a 3-story brick structure built in the 1960s, functional and unremarkable from the outside, had been sitting in a state of administrative limbo, technically owned by the district, but not in active use. I made the offer through a real estate attorney. The district accepted it. The transaction was straightforward. What I did with the building took 14 months to complete. The renovation was the most deliberate architectural project I'd ever undertaken, and I worked on the design personally in a way that I hadn't with the Larson campuses, where I'd trusted the professionals I'd hired and stayed in my lane. This one I needed to be inside every decision of. What I did with the building took 14 months to complete. The renovation was the most deliberate architectural project I'd ever undertaken, and I worked on the design personally in a way that I hadn't with the Larson campuses, where I'd trusted the professionals I'd hired and stayed in my lane. This one I needed to be inside every decision of. I flew to Denison 4 times during the planning phase. I walked every floor of the building with the project architect, a quiet man named Adam who had done restoration work on institutional buildings before, and who had the rare ability to listen without inserting his own vision until you'd fully articulated yours. I walked the hallways where I'd spent 3 years. I stood in the room that had been room 114, Collins' room, and looked at the dimensions of it and thought about how to make a space that had been used for one purpose serve a completely different one. I stood at the front of that empty room for a long time. I stood where he'd stood. I looked at where my desk had been, the specific back left seat next to the window that I'd sat in for 2 years because it gave me the furthest point from his direct gaze without being conspicuously placed. I thought about what it had felt like to sit in that chair and measure every word before I said it. I thought about Nathan, who had sat 3 rows in front of me. I thought about the specific silence of the room after he'd said something cutting. The silence I described to you at the beginning of this story, the one that never fully leaves. And then I went to work. Room 114 became the center's main counseling suite. 4 private consultation rooms with natural light and acoustic insulation, designed to give people the privacy for conversations they'd never been able to have before. The hallways were widened where structurally possible. The administrative office, which in most schools is the most prominently placed space in the building, was deliberately located at the back of the 2nd floor, accessible but not imposing. The front entrance led directly into a common space, open, welcoming, with comfortable furniture and natural light, and on the south wall, a permanent display about the history of unacknowledged paternity in American institutional life. Not a grievance display, an educational one, the kind that contextualizes a problem rather than personalizing it. The facade work was the last thing completed. The stonemason I hired was a woman named Brooke, who had done memorial and institutional engraving work for 20 years, and who understood, from the first conversation I had with her, what the names on that wall needed to do. Not commemorate, testify. There's a difference. Commemoration is retrospective. Testimony is addressed to someone who might still be listening. The 14 names were carved in a clean serif typeface at eye level. No titles, no dates, just names, each one spaced so that it stood alone and was also clearly part of something collective. My mother's name among them. 14 women who had been told, in different ways and different moments, that what they knew about their own lives was not the story that was going to be told in public. The Denison Center for Unacknowledged Families opened on a cold Thursday in March, 3 weeks before the 2nd anniversary of the night Collins knocked on my father's door. The center is a support and resource organization for children raised without acknowledged fathers. Legal support, counseling, community programming, scholarship assistance. It operates as a non-profit funded, partly by the Larson Foundation and partly by a board of donors that I recruited personally. On the facade of the building, the same brick wall I'd walked past every morning of my high school life, the one that faces the street and catches the light in the afternoon, we carved 14 names, 14 women. Not every woman involved in Collins' history was willing to be named publicly, and I respected that completely. The 14 who chose to be there were there, among them, with her permission, my mother. I stood in front of that wall on the day it opened and read those names, and I don't have the right words for what I felt. I'll tell you what, it wasn't. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't the catharsis that the word revenge implies in its Hollywood register. It was closer to a completion, the closing of a circuit that had been open and live and conducting damage for 30 years. Collins came to that opening too. I didn't invite him. He came because the press coverage had made it public, and because, and yet, I understand this now, he still believed that wherever I was, there was something there that involved him, something he could still be at the center of, some final version of the exchange, where he held the relevant information. He found me near the east entrance during the reception. He was unaccompanied, diminished in a way that was physical as well as contextual. The room was full of people who knew what he'd done, and he moved through it with the specific posture of a man who has lost the gravity field that once oriented everyone around him. He came to where I was standing and said, without preamble, "You've destroyed my life." I looked at him for a moment, not with anger. I'd processed the anger years ago in Dr. Mitchell's office, and in the long nights of building and in the particular discipline of choosing, every day, to put the next stone in place, rather than stand in the ruins. What I looked at him with was something I could only describe as clarity. I said, "You destroyed my family first. I just showed the world how many others you destroyed before me." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he looked away, and I turned back to the people who had come to celebrate the opening of something built in the spaces he'd tried to close. He didn't leave immediately. He stayed for another 20 minutes or so, standing near the entrance, watching, and then he walked out. I watched him go. I want to tell you something about the way the story ends, because the ending isn't the ceremony, and it isn't the wall, and it isn't Collins walking out of a building that used to be his domain, and is now something made from the pieces of what he broke. The ending, the real ending, the one I carry, is quieter than all of that. I was 38 years old when the Denison Center opened. I drove back to Columbus that night alone, because I'd asked people not to make it a celebration in the conventional sense, and because the people who mattered most to me, my father, my mother separately, the small group of people who'd been with me through the construction of what I had built, had been there during the day, and I'd held those moments privately, and that was enough. I stopped at a diner outside of Columbus around 9 o'clock. I sat in a booth and ordered coffee and eggs, and I ate them slowly, while a rerun of a late-night show played on a TV mounted near the ceiling. 3 other people were in the diner, a couple near the window and an older man at the counter. Nobody paid attention to me. I was just a person eating eggs in a diner at 9 o'clock, which is one of my favorite categories of anonymous normalcy. I thought about Collins's face when I'd turned away from him at the Columbus opening. I thought about my father standing under the oak tree in his backyard. I thought about Nathan, who I'd had 3 phone conversations with since Rebecca found him, and who had told me that the center's legal support had helped him access records and resources he hadn't known existed. I thought about Kimberly, who had come to the Denison opening and had stood in front of the wall for a long time before turning to me and saying nothing, just nodding. I thought about what I'd said to Collins. I thought about whether I believed it. Here's what I've arrived at. And I'm telling you because you came this far into the story and you deserve the honest version of the ending. I won. By every external measure, professional, financial, institutional, reputational, the field is mine. The structure he built over 31 years has been taken apart, and the space where it stood has been rebuilt into something that does the specific opposite of what he did. The people he tried to diminish have resources they didn't have before. The story is in the record. His name is in the record too, in the way he didn't intend it to be, and I am permanently changed by the fact that it was necessary. Not ruined, not broken. I want to be careful here, because the simple version, revenge hollowed him out, is satisfying but not quite accurate. The more accurate version is that the architecture of who I am was built largely around what Collins did, and around undoing it. And now that the undoing is done, I'm still living in a building whose original design was shaped by a wound. Some of the rooms in there are good rooms. Some of them are useful rooms, rooms built by the discipline and the hunger and the watchfulness that the wound produced. But they're shaped by it. And I can't always tell anymore which parts of me would have been different if the wound had never happened. Laura, the woman who said I didn't know what I was protecting myself from, I think about that sentence most days. I think I know the answer now. I was protecting myself from the possibility of caring about something that could be taken from me, the way my engagement with learning was taken from me at 16. I built my professional life in a space where I was in control of the caring, where I chose what to invest in and what to protect and what to let in. That produced something valuable. It also produced the specific loneliness of a person who is very good at being present in a room and very guarded about what the room means to him. I'm working on that. That's the most accurate thing I can tell you about where I am now. The Larson Academy has 3 campuses. The Larson Foundation has a board of 9. The Denison Center's first cohort of scholarship recipients will start college in the fall. I get up every morning at 6, and I read for an hour before I check my phone, because that habit is one of the things I've kept from who I was before all of this. One of the things that belongs to the 15-year-old who used to walk to the library after school and read whatever Mrs. Hayes had left on the cart. Collins is 73 years old. He lives, as far as I know, in the same town. His wife is gone. His professional legacy is documented accurately in a public record that anyone can find. The last I heard, from Rebecca, who still occasionally checks in on the situation because she's thorough, was that he teaches a single course 1 semester per year at the community college, Introduction to American History, and that the enrollment is small. I don't think about him every day. I want to be honest about that. Because the version of this story where he occupies my daily consciousness would be a different kind of loss. I think about him sometimes when I'm in a school and I see a kid sitting in the back of a room with a specific expression that I recognize. When I'm reviewing a teacher's feedback record and I see a pattern that raises a flag. When I'm sitting in my car in a parking lot at night for reasons that make sense to me and no one else. I think about what he was trying to tell me in that hallway at the Denison opening when I turned away. I think I know. I think he wanted to explain, wanted to tell me some version of the story that still placed him at the center in a way that made sense, that made him legible to himself as something other than a man who used a classroom as a weapon against his own children. I think that's what resolution meant in his letter. He wanted a story that resolved him. That's not a story I'm able to write for him. The truth, buried for 30 years, scattered across grade books and transfer forms and the quiet exits of kids who couldn't name what was being done to them, turned out to be louder than anything he ever taught. Not because I was louder than him, because the truth, when it's built correctly, doesn't need volume. It just needs time and a place to stand. I built him a place to stand. I gave him exactly that, and then I went home. Stories like this happen more than you think. Someone right now is sitting in silence, building something the people who underestimated them will never see coming. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.